家好，欢迎收看全球瞭望，我是郭崇伦。川普当选以后，全球震撼，亚太国家尤其担心这会不会影响到奥巴马的亚太再平衡的政策。请看我们的报道。
川普一路出奇制胜，当选美国总統，對國際政壇投下震撼彈，也牽動亞洲布局。
トランプ次期大統領はまさに信頼することができる、信頼できる指導者であるとこのように確信をいたしました。
大选结果出炉后，日本首相安倍晋三隔天一早就主动出击，打电话给川普。日前更亲自飞往纽约和川普面谈，成为第一位与这位美国准总统会面的外国元首。不寻常的火速拜访，显示出日本急着要跟川普政权建立互信，延续同盟关系。
共に信頼関係を築いていくことができる、そう確信の持てる会談でありました。
而同样多次被川普点名的南韩，也积极展现拉拢姿态。川普在选战期间多次扬言要增加南韩军费，甚至从南韩撤军。面对这位难以捉摸的美国新总统，即使国内政局不稳，南韩总统朴槿惠也不忘致电祝贺，寻求川普对美韩同盟的认同。
관계 발전을 돈독히 해나가기 위한 방안을 면밀하게 점검할 필요가 있다고 생각합니다.
就连有菲律宾川普之称的菲律宾总统杜特地也对川普释出善意，表示愿意放下对美国的种种不满，改善两国关系。
At saka may mga armas talaga yan. Ngayon, dito tayo. Ayaw ko nga sabi ko makipag-away kasi nandiyan na si Trump. But I would like to congratulate President Trump. Mabuhay ka. At pareho tayo, nagmumura. Konting rason lang, mura ka agad. Pareho kami. Kaya lang sabi niya.
大陆国家主席习近平当然也向川普表达祝贺，期待两国关系有所进展。大陆官媒评论，川普当选显示出美国传统政治理念的失败，预测美国由企业家执政后可能会舍弃意识形态，改走经济利益优先的新路线。
我们期待着同美国新一届政府共同努力，推动中美关系持续健康稳定发展，造福两国和世界人民。
川普曾说，他只想当美国总统，不当世界共主，无意干涉别国事务。也就是说，奥巴马力推的重返亚洲政策，恐怕后继无人。日本和南韩未来可能得减少对美国的依赖，对 TPP 做最坏的打算，并重新评估国防和亚太局势。至于大陆、菲律宾和北韩，面对非典型的白宫新主人，即使复杂难料，却可能是和美国重建关系的新契机。UDN TV 综合报道。
我们今天特别在金华饭店访问了美国的知名的亚太战略专家，以及是普林斯顿大学的教授范亚伦范教授。Welcome, Professor Friedberg, to be on the show.
Thank you very much.
First of all, I think after Donald Trump get elected, a lot of countries are worried, especially among the Asian countries, whether he's going to change the rebalancing of Asia policy as it is right now. Now that Donald Trump said that he's not going to carry on with the TPP ratification, and also he mentioned that he's going to change some of the security alliance with the Asian countries. Would you care to talk a little about that?
Yes. I can understand why there is uncertainty. Mr. Trump doesn't have an extensive track record. Of course, he's never been in elected office and never been in government. He's made a number of statements. You mentioned the comments that he's made about TPP and also about the terms of U.S. alliances in the region. So it's not clear yet what he's going to do. There are also questions about who will be in his administration and what their views are. So it's natural that there should be some uncertainty. That's understandable. I think it will diminish as time goes on as it becomes clearer what he intends to do.
I was at the IMPR meeting yesterday, and you mentioned that two possibilities of Trump's policy toward China. One would be a muscular and confrontational policy. The other would be somewhat like he's thinking of making a big deal with China since he's coming out from a business background. What do you mean by the second possibility? I mean, we understand the containment and the confrontational one, but what makes you consider that he's probably were making not really a compromise, but agreement with China in a sense?
Well, the first of those two scenarios, and of course there are others that we could come up with, but they seem to me to be the dominant ones under discussion now in the United States. The first of those scenarios is really an extrapolation of things that he has already said about trade, and what some people around him have said about the desirability of increasing U.S. military capabilities and increasing the Navy, and so on. The second is more speculation, although there are some people who are around the campaign who have made some comments recently. Mr. Woolsey gave a speech in which he talked a little bit about what could be interpreted as a possible bargain between the United States and China, in which the United States would in some way accept China's rise and its increased influence in return for some not very clearly specified commitment on China's part not to upset the status quo. That's what he said. I don't know exactly what that means. So the question then is it possible that a new administration might consider exploring with China the idea of some kind of grand bargain? And that's something that people in the United States have talked about even before Mr. Trump. Some people have discussed this. And the plausibility of that scenario goes up a little bit because it also appears that Mr. Trump believes that he can improve relations with Russia and perhaps come to some kind of new understanding with the Russian government. And so maybe he is thinking or might be thinking in the same way about Asia and about China. So it's entirely speculative, but I think it's something worth considering as a possibility. And then the question is, what might the terms of such a bargain be? For example, might the United States agree to pull back some of its forces or agree to reduce the status of some of its commitments in the region in return for some kinds of commitments from China or some change on China's part in its economic policies, for example. So perhaps if we try to imagine what it would be like, those might be the terms. I don't think that this is very probable, but it is possible and worth considering.
Put in a more broader context, are you describing that maybe Donald Trump is an isolationist in terms of American foreign policy?
I don't know. I don't think that he's an isolationist in the sense that he thinks the United States should be completely detached from or disengaged from the rest of the world. He has expressed views about the utility of American alliances. He's used the slogan America First, which is associated historically in the United States with the isolationists of the 1930s. So there is some reason to be concerned about that, but he hasn't laid out a program that would specifically indicate that that's what his intention is.
What's his idea of having a strong defense, national defense, put in the whole picture? For instance, he said he wants to maintain 350 ships of Navy. What's that can fit into the overall picture of his foreign policy?
Well, it could conceivably be consistent with, if not an isolationist policy, a more disengaged American posture. In the interwar period, the United States was a powerful naval, it was a great naval power, but it was also disengaged, didn't have treaty commitments and alliances around the world. So you could have a strong but unilateralist policy, peace through strength, but without alliances and commitments. It's at least possible in theory. It could also be consistent with a continuation of something resembling the current American posture in the world, so continuation of alliances, but perhaps with some change in the terms of those alliances where somehow our allies would pay more and we would pay relatively less. That's concretely what Mr. Trump has said when he's talked about NATO or he's talked about Japan and Korea. As I understand it, he hasn't said we can do without those allies or we ought to terminate those alliances, but that somehow we should change the terms of the alliances. And it's notable that since his election, so in the past week, again, this hasn't come from Mr. Trump himself, so it's not clear that it's authoritative, but a number of the people around him or who claim to speak for him have said, well, he never indicated a desire to terminate our alliances. We simply want to change their terms. So there may be a little bit of, if it's not backing away, then clarification. The one thing that he said concretely is others should pay more.
Okay. People are saying we shouldn't pay too much attention to a presidential candidate when he haven't won the election yet.
Right.
And then, so people are saying that Donald Trump will get back to the usual traditional U.S. policy. That's one possibility. The second possibility is that the people working for him, that is going to pull him back to the right track. But my question is more like, he is coming from the outside of Republican mainstream, and his style and his speaking had offended a lot of people. A lot of people had disassociated themselves from the Trump campaign. So is he getting the best mind to work for him, or is he getting the expert that had been established in those fields, especially on foreign policy, security, and national defense, and can stand up to Donald Trump saying that, President, we are not doing the thing like you have said, that people are not expecting us to do like that. Can we find those people around him?
It's early because we don't yet know who the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the CIA director is going to be. I think there were news reports a few hours ago that General Flynn was going to be the National Security Advisor. So even at the very top levels, we don't know who the appointees are going to be, let alone the people who would be beneath them and would fill out the ranks of the bureaucracy. So we don't know the answer to that question yet. Of course, regardless of who those people are, if the president decides that he wants to go in a certain direction, he can impose his will and do what he wants, and appointees can either quit or stay. So even having a bureaucracy that's filled with people of more conventional views isn't a guarantee that a president might not pursue unconventional policies, but presumably it matters, especially if someone who doesn't have experience in government. It matters who the advisors are and what they're telling him. He may choose not to listen to them, but it makes a difference who they are, and we don't yet know who they're going to be. And
I'm interested in what you just said. When the president wants to do something, he can always get his will done. And the two White House major staff just been announced. It seems that the chief of strategists seem to be even higher than the chief of staff of White House. Mr. Barron now seems to have Donald Trump's full trust in this. Would he bring up a very different style of decision-making or in terms of foreign policy, different from we have seen previous administration?
Well, people have said that Mr. Trump in his business dealings likes to have competing centers of power beneath him so that he can then manipulate people and get information. That would be unconventional. It wouldn't be entirely without precedent. FDR, I'm a little reluctant to appear to compare Mr. Trump to FDR, but Franklin Roosevelt had an unusual management style where he had different people with overlapping authority. So it's conceivable that he could do things quite differently. He obviously thinks of himself as a person with a lot of management experience. He thinks of himself clearly as someone who's been very successful in business, and in my limited experience with such people, they tend to believe that they know how to do things and they know how to get things done, and they know what the right answers are. They may or may not be willing to listen to advice. But again, and I'm sorry to keep saying this, but we don't know. We'll have to see. But you would certainly think there's a higher probability, given everything we know thus far about Mr. Trump and his background and his statements, that he will not govern in the way that, for example, President Obama governed or President Bush before him.
We just mentioned that President-elect Trump is not going to pursue the TPP project. And while in the meantime, we are seeing China is proceeding with its grand strategy of One Belt, One Road. And so far, Obama administration have been reluctant to join in. Japan and United States is two major countries haven't joined the AIIB project. But Trump seemed to imply that they are hoping to join AIIB. What do you think his attitude would be for One Belt One Road or the AIIB, the China initiative?
Well, very specifically, I don't think he has said anything about AIIB or One Belt One Road. Again, it was this one speech by Mr. Woolsey to the effect that the Obama administration had mishandled the AIIB issue, and the United States ought to be more receptive to some of the proposals. So that's a little bit of, I don't know if it's evidence, but it's only one statement by one person who we don't even know is going to be involved in the administration. So there is no clearly stated policy. You mentioned that the Chinese are pushing ahead now, and in the aftermath of statements that make it fairly clear that the United States isn't going ahead with TPP, other countries, including Australia, seem to be more receptive to the Chinese proposals to create free trade areas. In my view, it's a mistake for the United States not to go ahead with TPP, and one of the reasons is that it opens the way for China to shape the region more according to its interests and in ways that may be counter to ours and those of our friends in the long run. So I think it's a mistake for us to back away from TPP, and it's one that's going to be costly for some of our friends and allies, including especially the Japanese, where political leadership, Prime Minister Abe, had gone to great lengths to push ahead through his government with support for TPP. So we're going to pay a price for that, I think.
Is that means that if United States constitute about 60% of the total TPP countries' economic scale, but if the U.S. is not attending, that means there's a collapse of TPP. And what would the rest of the 11 countries go into? Some are saying that maybe we should ask China to join in, or we should integrate with the RCEP that is going on. What would be the possibility, do you think?
Well, I don't think they could do that and have an agreement with the sorts of specific conditions the TPP includes, these high-level rules and regulations regarding state-owned enterprises and intellectual property and so on. One of the reasons for doing it in the way that it was done was to set that high standard and hope that others would seek to meet the standard, including China. So whatever agreements come next, whatever agreements others in the region might sign on to that are advanced by China are not going to have those high-quality rules and safeguards. Some people I know have suggested that there might now be possibilities for more bilateral agreements, including bilateral agreements between the United States and others in the region, including potentially Taiwan. And to be fair to Mr. Trump, he has said that he's not opposed to trade and he's not opposed to trade agreements, but he's taken the position that, as I understand it, virtually all existing trade agreements are not satisfactory from the point of view of the United States, and that he is going to negotiate better ones. So if we take him at his word, it's certainly possible that over the next few years, the United States under President Trump will seek to negotiate new trade agreements. Maybe the bilateral would be more likely than the multilateral agreements.
We're going to take a short break and come back. We're going to talk about what's Taiwan concerned about the new president. 等一下回来，我们继续跟范雅伦教授来做访谈。
川普入主白宫，对台湾关系未来走向持续成为关注目标。14号，立法院外交国防委员会质询中提到，川普新任命的幕僚长普博斯跟台湾关系交好，连外交部长李大为也表示，双方关系非常密切。
所以 Purpose 事实上跟台湾的关系长久以来是非常密切的，
非常的密切，
对不对？
他在7月15号到18号也接见我们的这个参加共和党党大会的团。
普博斯是川普竞选团队大将，更是华府的圈内人。去年10月，台湾总统大选期间，就曾来台与蔡英文会面。幕僚长相较于我方的总统府秘书长职位，该任命对台湾的外交有正面注意。川普当选对台军售状况，国安局报告认为，川普可能要求台湾提升自我防卫能力，扩大军售范围。
就以往的军售的这个 record 来看的话，那么共和党在传统上，它都在军售这方面， 是比较有我的。
军售啊，这个武器的需求啊，在您所来看来，当然有优先顺序。
对。
但是我们要从几个角度来看啊，第一个从我们的国防预算的角度来看。第二个呢，从我们的防卫需求上来看，
我知道吗？所以
立委认为，国防部不能因为美国对台军售而放弃国防自主，也不能无限制追加预算。国防部长信誓旦旦的回复，军售决定权还是在我方，预算不用改，已经签订的合约也不会改变。
我想等他一旦进入白宫以后，很多的他看到了很多情报资料分析以后啊，他的政策一定会跟原来做候选人的想法有距离。
外界忧心，川普选战时主张的保护主义会影响双边关系。李大卫一派轻松，但面对来自陆方的压力，陆委会副主委林正义则是警告，对岸不断施压，未来台湾参与国际组织的机会可能更加渺茫。
习近平在2013年，实际上他已经掌权了，但是对于国际民航组织，并没有像胡锦涛在给台湾参与世界卫生大会给予观察员的这种的思考。
UDN-TV 徐宇威、李永平台北报道。
川普当选究竟对台湾是利还是弊，有不同的说法。从经贸的冲突到弃台论，大家都有自己不同的解读。不过这还是要看谁会被川普任命为跟台湾相关的政策官员。我们继续跟范亚伦教授来做访谈。Dr. Friedberg, I will turn to Taiwan, especially. Do you think we will have reason to worry about Trump new administration, especially he is people say that he don't know that much about what's happening in Taiwan. There's even a joke whether he can distinguish Thailand from Taiwan. But anyway, what can we expect with Donald Trump when we are worried that he doesn't know about the Taiwan Relation Act or the six assurance coming from the previous administration? Are we have reason to worry a Trump administration?
I don't think there's reason, based on anything we know so far, to fear that a Trump administration would deliberately distance itself from Taiwan or terminate the current relationship with Taiwan. I suppose that could happen, but I don't see any reason to think so. As far as I'm aware, Mr. Trump hasn't said anything about that. He's said even less about Taiwan than, for example, he said about Japan or South Korea, where he's made the statements that we discussed earlier about burden sharing and costs. So there's no evidence, there's nothing that's in the record that I'm aware of that would cause one to have concern on that issue. In addition, although we don't know the significance of these statements and articles and so on, there have been a number of pieces written by people who are involved or have been involved in the campaign and might conceivably play a role in a Trump administration to the effect that the United States should increase its support for Taiwan. So people in the Republican Party and some of the people around Mr. Trump in recent years have been critical of the Obama administration, which they've argued hasn't done enough to provide Taiwan with weapons it needs to defend itself. So it's at least possible that, in fact, the U.S. might increase its military support to Taiwan under a Trump administration. But again, we don't know if that's actually going to happen. There are some other questions, and I think this is what you are implying or suggesting in your reference to the assurances and the Taiwan Relations Act. The relationship between the United States, China, and Taiwan, of course, is very carefully balanced and choreographed, and all American presidents coming in have to learn what exactly the verbal formulations are and what to say and what not to say for fear of causing some kind of upset. So I suppose there would be some reason to be concerned that Mr. Trump might perhaps be more likely than his predecessors to, whether he intends it or not, to use language or to say things that could cause some concern. But I don't think any mistake of that sort is likely to seriously destabilize the relationship across the straits.
Let's put the President-elect Trump aside and just talk about there's a structural factor here. Whenever Taiwan had a new president, very soon the U.S. will have a new president. And because now in the Ma administration, there's relatively peace across relations. Now it's somewhat in a stalemate between the new Tsai administration with China. Are you worried that this kind of stalemate would turn into a tension or even an accidental confrontation, just like the missile had been misfired a while ago? And do you believe that it's in the U.S. interest to get involved and try to resolve this kind of stalemate?
There's always a risk, I think, and there has been for some time, of conflict, intended or otherwise, because this relationship between the mainland and Taiwan remains unresolved and is, from the mainland perspective, unsatisfactory. Clearly, even if Taiwan accepts the status quo and doesn't really want to change it in fundamental ways, the Chinese have said clearly that they do. They want to compel unification or reunification, as they would see it. So there's always risk. I think some of these concerns have grown in recent years because of the increased military capabilities that China has developed, some of them clearly intended to enhance its ability to bring pressure to bear on Taiwan and perhaps also to deter the United States in a possible future contingency from intervening on Taiwan's behalf. So the shifts in the military balance, the remaining stalemate, the persisting stalemate, means that there's always some risk. And as you mentioned, changes in administration here in Taiwan raise that possibility too, especially when the person coming to power, like President Tsai, is from a party that the Chinese don't like and don't trust. So there are always risks. Whether there are greater risks going forward in the next couple of years may depend primarily on what happens here and on whether the current administration does or doesn't do things that could antagonize the mainland. But from what I've seen in my conversations with people since I've been here, I don't see any indication of a desire or an intention to do that. The president seems to have a fairly level and careful approach to the whole issue of unification and relations with the mainland, and I think that gives some reason for optimism about what the next several years are going to be like. There is another X factor in the equation, which is the possibility that the mainland, for its own reasons, might choose to increase pressure on Taiwan, whether because of domestic unrest or elite political conflict in Beijing. That's always a possibility, and we can't discount that.
Let me ask, just suppose the things goes on as it was, that Taiwan will be very, very prudent not to provoke China and seek independence, and the U.S., the new administration, have its learning curve and then get back to the normal practice, like it's dealing with China and Taiwan. But in the long term, what Taiwan afraid the most is the abandonment argument of Taiwan. I quoted here from one of the so-called realists, that American policymakers will eventually conclude that it makes good strategic sense to abandon Taiwan and allow China to coerce Taiwan into accepting unification. The argument goes like this: would the Chinese economy keep growing, the military expenditure become increasing, and to a certain point that the U.S. will find militarily involved in Taiwan would be unrational, unwise to do it. So they decided to abandon Taiwan. Do you think that is a plausible argument, or is it something basically flawed in here?
Well, I don't accept it as certainly not as a prescription for American policy, which some of the people who have made those arguments have advocated abandonment of Taiwan by the United States, which I think would be a severe mistake, a serious mistake. But the people you're referring to, I think, are political scientists, academics. Academics like to have theories about things. As one, I can tell you that. And there's a tendency, I think, often to draw straight lines and to say the current trends are such and such, and they will continue, and this can't possibly be sustained. But it seems to me there are a number of problems with that argument. First of all, we don't know at what pace China is going to continue to grow, whether it's going to continue to grow and become more powerful. The arguments of people who favor abandonment of Taiwan also seem to assume that the United States and its friends and allies in Taiwan as well are somehow incapable in the long run of defending themselves and maintaining a balance of power that would deter aggression. I don't see any reason for believing that to be the case. That's whether or not China grows. It's certainly not inevitable that it will be impossible at some point to continue to defend Taiwan. I also think that this argument is flawed because it assumes that if the United States did abandon Taiwan, it could continue as if nothing else had happened to support its other commitments and defend its interests in this part of the world and elsewhere. One of the reasons why I don't think it's likely the United States would do that is because of concerns about the implications for our credibility, and so our ability then to maintain our alliance with Japan or Korea or in other parts of the world. One other thing which I think makes this argument somewhat dated is that people began to say these kinds of things when it seemed as if the only remaining source of tension between the United States and China, the only conceivable source of conflict between the United States and China was Taiwan. So maybe 15 or 20 years ago that might have appeared to be the case. But as China's power has grown, as its behavior has become more aggressive, as it's become clearer that it desires to change some important aspects of the status quo in this part of the world, and not only the status of Taiwan, but for example, the disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, I think it's become harder to make the case that if we would only somehow solve the problem of Taiwan, everything would be stable and would be favorable to our interests. Again, I don't think that's true, and it's become more evident that Taiwan is not the principal source of tension or possible friction or even possible conflict between the United States and China. So for all of those reasons, it doesn't seem to me either likely or desirable that the United States should abandon Taiwan.
There's another side argument saying that in order to avoid a total confrontation between China and the United States, there may be a need for a grand bargain that be formed, just like it happened in 19th century in Europe and in other places, that both sides should make a deal with each other and then set up their core interests or their sphere of influence, and somehow the United States should recognize that China could have its own Monroe Doctrine, that it should have its sphere of influence. What do you say to that argument?
Well, there are a couple of problems with it, at least from the point of view of the United States. The United States doesn't act only in terms of the pursuit of its material interests. For better or worse, historically, we've been motivated also by our commitments to certain values. And the fact that Taiwan is now a thriving democracy, I think, makes it even less likely that the U.S. would abandon Taiwan than it might have been 20 or 30 years ago or before the full liberalization of Taiwan's politics. And if you look historically, certainly over the course of the Cold War, the United States defended and maintained commitments to friends and treaty allies and positions in the world which on the map didn't look like they made a lot of sense. The United States continued its commitment to defend West Berlin, even though Berlin was surrounded by East Germany and by Soviet forces. The United States has maintained a commitment, not a treaty commitment, to Israel over the last half century. And there are many people who have argued that that didn't make sense strategically, that it was disadvantageous for the U.S., but a large part of that has to do with our commitment to another democracy. So that factor, I think, can't be ruled out. The other problem with these arguments about spheres of influence, whatever you think of Taiwan, if we were to imagine a sphere that China might consider to be acceptable, so within the first island chain or the second island chain, there happen to be some other very large and important countries that are also treaty allies of the United States that would fall within that sphere. So South Korea, Japan. So I don't think that we're very likely to abandon those countries either. Now, I guess you could say that because of China's rising power, it's going to be necessary to work out some mode of operating in this part of the world where China has a greater role and greater influence, and the United States is not simply as dominant as it once was. And that certainly is possible, perhaps likely, but I don't think that then leads you to the conclusion that somehow the United States has to pull back. There's one other problem with those arguments, and it goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago as regards Taiwan, is the argument of those who favor abandonment is that somehow this would satisfy China and would create a status quo that would then be stable. I don't see any reason to believe that. Rising powers perhaps are more inclined to expand the sphere of their influence and their interests, the definition of their interests, if they feel that they're gaining by doing that. So I don't think we would solve our problems with China or eliminate any claims that they might make in this part of the world if we were to give way. You know, there's this story about a Chinese admiral apparently having a conversation with his American counterpart, I think this was in 2008, saying, well, the Pacific is big enough for both of us, we should divide it. You can have everything to the east of Hawaii and we'll have everything to the west. Well, it's a joke, but I think it revealed something about what at least some people in China would like to be true, but that isn't going to happen.
Finally, I was educated in the States, and I think what you just mentioned, the American is not leading only by military or by economic might, it also leads by value. But this election campaign really disappointed a lot of people. I mean, it's not the final result, but also the whole campaign process is unprecedented. The character assassination, those kind of things. What's your reflection on that, and what it had to do with the soft power of the United States had for the rest of the world?
Well, I'm certainly concerned about it as a citizen. I think it was a disgraceful election, and I think that Mr. Trump was largely responsible for the character of the election campaign. And in my view, he has to demonstrate now as president that he's capable of rising above those tendencies and behaving in a way that's more fitting for a leader of the most powerful country in the world. So I understand why it's distasteful. At the same time, lots of countries have tumultuous politics. I understand occasionally there are fistfights in the Taiwan legislature, and that happens in Tokyo and Korea and other places too. So in part, that's the vibrancy of democracy. It's not always pretty. The last thing to say here is that the people who have, I think, taken the most satisfaction from the ugliness of our political campaign are people who don't believe in democracy. And I'm thinking especially of the Chinese and the Russian leadership. So they have an interest in saying to their own people, but also to people in their region and around the world, this is what democracy is. It's a mess. It's ugly. Wouldn't you rather have a system like ours that's very stable and where the leaders are carefully selected and so on? So the people who are most pleased by this are the people who are least sympathetic to democracy, because I think they know if their people had the right to express their views, they would probably be out of a job.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friedberg.
Thank you
for taking the interview with us.
It's a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you.